I love Darkest Dungeon. Peak gameplay, peak aesthetic, peak music, what more could you want? Peak world building, perhaps. But how can that be the case if it doesn't have a 7,000-page lore primer on every windowsill on the estate? That's because Darkest Dungeon is a champion of soft world building. That's to say, the type of world building that forgoes an exceptional amount of detail in exchange for relying on aesthetic and tone to convey ideas that are not always explicitly stated. While in my own writing, I'm a little more of a hard world builder, I have a lot of respect for soft world building, and you probably do too, as it's almost the default of any given story, though it does take a little more for it to really shine. Basically, every single fairy tale has soft world building. They aren't meant to sell you specific places or people so much as specific ideas. Modern stories do this sort of thing too, with most horror movies being a good example. You know, the type where there's a not particularly specific group of teenagers in a not particularly specific forest being killed by a monster that doesn't exist for a particularly specific reason. Whether you consider that particularly effective or not will depend on a case-by-case basis and your own personal opinion, but in the case of Darkest Dungeon, I would call it effective indeed. So in case you aren't too aware of what Darkest Dungeon is and you just clicked on the video because it said world building and had a thumbnail with cool art on it, Darkest Dungeon is a turn-based roguelike strategy game in which you inherit an estate from your deceased ancestor. The problem is that your ancestor was an insane Cthulhu worshipper and unleashed unknowable horrors on the estate and the little town that surrounds it. He takes a self-inflicted dosage of lead to the cranium and leaves you with the bill and the mess to clean up all by your lonesome. Except you aren't by your lonesome because we have the two absolute legends, Reynald the Crusader and Dismas the Highwayman, to help us along the way. Or at least you do if you don't get them killed immediately. I managed to keep them alive all the way to the end on my run, and that remains one of my proudest achievements in gaming. Anyway, you don't have just them, but a slew of other characters, the Abomination, the Plague Doctor, the Flagellant, and many more. It's in seeing these characters and the absolutely wonderful character comics associated with each of them that we see one of my favorites of Darkest Dungeon's soft world-building triumphs. These comics are surprisingly impactful despite, between all of them combined, only containing 7 words. Final Notice, Overdraft, and Past Due in the Grave Robbers, and Missing in the Houndmasters. They don't have dialogue or exposition, but convey everything they need to with visuals and expression alone. Even if Darkest Dungeon wasn't a great video game, it would still be lauded for its art. As far as the world building goes, however, each of these little comics tells us something. It allows us to parse together parts of the world, but they also exist in vague enough terms that it maintains this sort of mystique to it. So we're gonna talk about all of them. They alone could almost make up the entire video because even in their simplicity, there's just a lot to them. We start with Abominations, and his is pretty simple. It's a guy locked up because he changes into a sort of eldritch werewolf every now and again, and whoops, now he's loose. Antiquarians is pretty simple, but effective at storytelling. There's a ritual, and she stops it, not to save the person being sacrificed it seemed, but to merely do the ritual herself, which considering she becomes a villain in Darkest Dungeon 2 is almost not surprising. The Arbalists is pretty interesting, and almost an example of how soft world building works in of itself. It gives the distinct impression of something like a lynching, and yet we don't have the specifics. We don't know what the reason is, or if there is one at all for her family being attacked. What is known is that a mob comes to kill the child and her family, so her father sends her out by herself, armed with a crossbow, so that even if she's alone, she'll never be defenseless. And really, just with that, with no concrete details otherwise, it's effective and conveys emotion. And that, of course, is the key to soft world building. Where you lack in the capability to, per se, intellectually intrigue, you make up for it in raw feeling, which requires an entirely different type of skill that is worth developing if you want to write yourself, whether your own world building will be more hard or more soft. Next is Bounty Hunters, and his is fun because in of itself it's very straightforward. He comes, he finds his target, takes him out, and even leaves a calling card because that's what the Bounty Hunter's all about. However, we can even talk about something here, which is the ambiguity of the advancement of technology in the setting, which we know I love to talk about from previous videos. Much of this game is a sort of gothic Victorian sort of look, look that matches with the aesthetic commonly associated with Lovecraft and all that sort of thing. And yet it brings in medieval and Renaissance aesthetics as well. This isn't something you can pull off quite as easily in a universe that is based on more hard world building. But here we know so precious little about the world we exist in that the meshing together of these historical eras just sort of works. So a medieval-ish bounty hunter can exist in the same game that has 18th century muskets, 19th century architecture, and 17th century clothing. Then we have Crusaders. Crusaders is either my favorite or my second favorite of these, because it conveys one of the most effective messages emotionally. He leaves his family to go to war, presumably so that he may help financially support them, but he becomes a killer. He rises through the ranks and becomes a mighty warrior. And when he returns, he isn't the man he departed as. He is fundamentally the helmet and the mask as much as the man wearing it. And thus, returning home to his simple life is no longer a viable option in his mind, so he turns back to continue what he was doing. We don't necessarily know what he crusaded for, and we don't need to. But the idea, and this of course is hinted at during the game, is that he is at the same time this sort of holy warrior driven by faith and creed, and yet at the same time one who abandoned his family, and that's a very interesting contrast. Then of course there's the angle that the original Crusader's name, Reynaud, alludes to the historical Reynaud of Châtillon. My French isn't very good, so I'm sorry if that was wrong. A crusader who was a prince of the kingdom of Jerusalem, who would beat Saladin in battle before later being beaten in return and beheaded. Reynaud also always spawns with the kleptomaniac trait, which is probably an allusion to the historical Reynaud being a prolific plunderer. Then comes the Flagellants comic. This is another pretty simple one. He's a beggar, used to constant abuse and punishment, and finally decides to embrace the pain the world has inflicted upon him and use it for his own ends. It isn't the most thought-provoking per se, but in being so barren of information, so much the absolute epitome of conservation of detail, it still manages to tell us everything we need to know about him. And then the complete opposite is Grave Robbers, which comes next, which leaves us with probably the most questions. We have a widow in a large estate who's run out of money. Maybe she spent it all, maybe her late husband didn't leave any of his wealth to her. We don't even know how he died, really. But our best guess, even without knowing about the second game's backstory for her, is that she might have poisoned him, given she has a lot of blight abilities in the game, which is an interesting way of answering a question there was not room to answer within the comic. Regardless, she remembers that her late husband was buried with a bit of wealth on him. She seeks it out, presumably continues to do so with other graves, and thus earns her title. Then we have the Hellion, who, if we want to compare her to real history, goes about as far back as the Picts when we're talking about like when these groups were from, with their popular depiction of covering themselves in blue war paint being the giveaway. It stands out, and you could almost call this anachronistic, but there really just isn't enough known about this world for us to definitively say, no, there shouldn't be this. We don't know where the estate is, and trying to place it anywhere too specific in the real world is intentionally going to cause contradictions. In any case, the Hellion's character is established by showing us that her past cowardice contributed to the death of her people, and that is probably why she gives off the impression within the game of being violent and barbaric, if not cruel. The Houndmaster is next, and his would be my third favorite. He's a man of the law hunting down a missing woman. He finds her being strung up as a sacrifice for an occult ritual in service of the same eldritch evil that infests the estate, and then it turns out one of the people responsible for the ritual is a fellow lawman. This one might do the most work for the world building of Darkest Dungeon, giving us that classic gothic trope of the world of darkness and corruption, where those who are meant to uphold peace and order are often the worst perpetrators of cruelty and chaos. And the Highwayman's is the other one that might be my favorite. A thoughtless killer and robber who easily and without mercy dispatches the drivers of a coach. He blasts one shot through the window expecting it to slay another foe, and then opens the door to see this. A heart of stone no more, and thus he becomes one of the most interesting characters, the regretful criminal who now seeks redemption for his misdeeds. And this is why my favorite achievement for the game for both Darkest Dungeons actually, is by completing them with the Crusader and the Highwayman. On the old road, we found redemption. Both seek to make amends for their personal failures, and much like his Crusader buddy, the Highwayman has a set name, that of Dismas, traditionally meant to be the name of the good thief that asked Jesus for mercy and died on the cross alongside him. Especially compared to that of Reynald's historical name, this one hints towards that sort of hidden theme of Darkest Dungeon, that of redemption even in a world of darkness. Then there's the Jester. This panel reminds me of Stanchik wycieszy bal na dworze królowej bony wobec strakonego Smolensk, otherwise known as Stanchik, which is probably my favorite painting of all time. I never thought I'd have a reason to mention that painting in a video, so that's checked off my bucket list now. Anyway, in the Jester's panel, we see him playing for the ball, all while remembering his various mistreatments at the hands of the nobles and attendants. At its end, he slaughters them all and makes his happy way out. Next is the Leper, most often known as Baldwin. He's a very direct reference to Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, a successful king who lived for about 24 years. He contracted leprosy as a child, and it became increasingly debilitating throughout his life. Darkest Dungeon takes this concept, runs with it, and has the leper character abandon his throne, presumably so that his kingdom will be forced to find a new king rather than rely on him with his failing health. The fact that this still works, despite the theme and location of it having nothing to do with fighting eldritch entities, is a testament to the quality of, say it with me, soft world building. Next, we've got the Man-at-Arms, whose armor and clothing definitely suggests a core Renaissance sort of vibe. His isn't much about the world, but to show us that his story is of him seeking to retrieve the banner rather than save the injured soldier he's been carrying with him. And in the end, he seems to realize, buried amongst the dead, that that banner is just a piece of cloth. The Musketeer is next, and much like her comparison to the Arbalest in game, hers is not as interesting as the Arbalest, but alas, she's at a shooting competition and seems to be visited by some sort of eldritch vision causing her to miss. Pretty straightforward, but at least it does explain why she's specifically seeking out fighting eldritch things. And I suppose it does also show us that these sort of eldritch goings-on in the world don't just exist around the estate. But that is more and better proven by the occultist who's next, and the main thing to draw from this one is actually very significant to the world building. In finding an eldritch statue in an Egyptian, or at least Egyptian-esque pyramid, we are told that the existence and worship of the eldritch entities that the heroes fight against dates back to the most ancient of days, which is interesting enough in of itself. The Plague Doctor is just a little silly. Her professor gets sick, dies, and she dissects him. Good story and establishment for her character, though not a whole lot else to say here other than universities exist, I guess. The Shield Breaker, much as the Plague Doctor, has a good story. One where she frees herself and is saved by a sort of mysterious serpent. Not as much on the world building, but it's still good. However, we end with the Vestal, who is another heavy hitter for a major concept in this setting, that of the contradictions of faith. Hers holds her back from the sort of sensual experiences of life, given that she is a nun. We don't really know if she chose the life of a nun or if it was chosen for her, but we see it all the same. Throughout Darkest Dungeon, faith is a sort of recurrent subject. It does sort of seem like the Eldritch Gods really are the power in this universe. And yet, the faith-based abilities possessed by the characters like the Crusader or Vestal seem to work, so who knows? But with that, we are finally through all of the character bios and can talk about some of the game itself. The first idea, and a direct segue from the character bios, is the idea that there are more than one of each of these heroes that we just talked about. From a strictly logical perspective, it doesn't make any sense that we can get more Crusaders after the first one dies, or even just have multiple copies in general, especially given that he is exactly the same, save for maybe a different name and a palette switch. While I do like the approach of the second game, in which when heroes die they're more so reincarnated than replaced, that only works because of the specific world building of the second game, and it just wouldn't fit in the first one, and I do think there is a point to the way they do it in this first game. That being, in my opinion, that in this world where we don't know all of the specifics, it's just sort of this kind of place that produces these people. The dispossessed, the guilty, the flawed, and the violent. So, from a soft world building perspective, these replacement characters are meant to show us that there will always be more of the greedy and foolish to brave the depths, and all have the reasons for doing so that are informed by the ravages of a cruel world. Or maybe I'm just reading too far into an obviously needed game mechanic. The next aspect of the world building I want to talk about is how the existence of the enemies and their varieties is justified in-game. This is probably something you've never thought about before, even if you've played the game, but that is one of those other places where this type of world building can shine, in making things intuitively make sense without having to thoroughly explain them. And so, very simply, Darkest Dungeon takes the unknowability of what the eldritch entities beneath the estate can do, and uses that to produce varieties of enemies that make intuitive sense, all while you can still hear hints towards what exactly created each of them as you load into levels and uncover the ancestors' journals. So there are several regions within the game, and each of them has 2 different bosses, each of which is associated with a different type of enemy. So the first region that players tend to go to is the Ruins. Here reside the undead legions who once in life protected the estate, who have now risen back into eternal service at the hand of the necromancers that the ancestor himself once killed and raised from the dead. In case you don't already know, pretty much every problem here is entirely the ancestor's fault. It's to a degree one might wonder why the player character doesn't decide, screw it, I'm not fixing this. But then you realize, maybe in a sort of meta sense, that that is what happens in universe when someone actually gives up on completing the game. The other subsection of enemies in the Ruins, however, come at the hand of this prophet guy. They're the cultists of the new god that lives below the estate. The prophet initially came to be one of the few people to identify the threat that the ancestor posed. However, after being lured into the catacombs beneath the estate, he was driven mad and essentially chose to switch teams. Anyway, yeah, that's the Ruins. Necromancers, undead, cultists, and a raving lunatic. Hooray. The next area is the Weald, a more antiquated way of saying the Wilds, where there are a variety of problems. Witches, bandits, and a nasty fungal infection. Here we have the Hag, who was once a close confidant to the ancestor, but as more and more of the horror that lay beneath the estate was unveiled, she began a series of experiments on herself that led to her becoming the Hag we see today. The other half of the Weald is dominated by the bandits who've taken over in the chaos. I must say, of all the places to be a bandit in, this would not be my first choice. But what can you do? They're also quite well armed, as their boss enemy is basically a tank. How'd they get it? I have no idea. Then we have the Warrens, which are probably the creepiest of the base starting locations. This was basically the ancestor's trash can, where he threw the refuse from his experiments. In an incredibly surprising turn of events, throwing a bunch of eldritch magical refuse into one place resulted in some bad things happening. Now there is the Flesh, a horrible amalgam, the Swine King, a terrible massive pig monster, and the worst of them by far, this little bastard Wilbur. And so the Warrens are a hub of mutation, decay, and swine people. Then we have the Cove, which is where we get to see Darkest Dungeon's take on the Lovecraftian fish person trope. Not only were many of the ancestors' occult dealings done here, but he was also apparently making deals with the fish people early on, which also seems like it was probably a bad idea long term. Here, our bosses we're dealing with include the Drowned Crew, which is a bunch of smugglers that the ancestor had used to bring him accursed objects from all across the globe. They asked him for too much money one time, so he gave them a cursed anchor that sunk their ship and forced them to relive their last moments forever. This ancestor's really just such a gem. Next is the Siren, who used to be a young girl the ancestor was seeing, until she started to know too much and the ancestor saw her transformed into this thing, which now does what sirens do. That covers the locations we see in the base game, but there are actually 2 more that have been added over time as DLC. The first of those is the Courtyard, which has this really interesting yet disturbing mix of insects and vampires, giving us the Bloodsucker enemy type. Most of the bosses that you encounter here are nobles who used to engage in the various hedonisms of the estate back in its heyday. There's also a pretty cool crocodile. But of course, most significant is the Countess, whom the ancestor was courting before deciding to murder her because it was something interesting to do. As is implied, he'd basically experienced so many heights of experience that only cold-blooded murder would even be interesting anymore. Slanesh would be proud. Then, of course, remember that this is Darkest Dungeon. He didn't just kill her, but drained her blood, put it in the wine, and then made the rest of the guests drink it. This caused the outbreak of the Crimson Curse, the thing that afflicts all of the monsters here, and also left him in charge of the realm the estate is set in. I like this detail because it sort of ties up a few questions without getting bogged down. It shows us that the ancestor consolidated power pretty effectively, and that at a point there was nobody left to stop this man, who'd let himself be utterly consumed by excess. And finally, we have the farmlands where a big crystalline comet landed. While it's often described as alien, we need to remember the mythos we're working with here. We're not talking like space gray alien types. We're talking alien in the sense of Lovecraftian myth. Plenty of the elder gods are said to rule or hail from other planets, and this comet is of that sort of variety, while still taking on its own identity. Another thing to note about the farmland is that it's probably the most pitiable when we think about the people that used to live there, as they were just farmers as opposed to bandits, smugglers, hedonistic nobles, or what have you. As the ancestor says, they, and the miller who is at the center of the comet's landing in particular, were thrice victims, screwed over by the blight that took their crops, screwed over by the ancestor when they asked him for help, and screwed over by the comet by making them into these things. A rough time for them indeed. With that though, we've basically covered most of the significant stuff in Darkest Dungeon. There is, of course, the Darkest Dungeon itself, but on the off chance that some of you watching haven't actually beaten the game, I'd rather not talk about it too much, because it was a far cooler and more impactful sequence than I expected going in. So I'd rather just say, if you have any interest in the game and haven't played it yet, do so. It's hard, but not only is it fun to play, it really is a great example of a certain kind of world building that can work super well when done with purpose and intent. However, I will say this about the ending. The name of the final boss is not accidental nor coincidental. So if you get there and you don't immediately know what I mean by saying that, look it up. Anyway, it really is, at the end of the day, that perfect use of conservation of detail, focusing only on what exactly we should care about and leaving plenty of room for mystery that sees Darkest Dungeon gain its unique, grim charm. With all that in mind, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any thoughts of your own about Darkest Dungeon or soft world building in general, I read every comment and would love to see them. In addition, every single like and subscription goes a long way since we're still small here at JBat, and we also have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it. We also post all of our videos a week early over there. On that note, I'd like to thank our patrons: Shadowrunner and Sani, Knights of the Inner Circle, Nico, Knight, and Greer, a new patron, a squire. Thank you guys, I hope you enjoyed, and remember,
overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer.